Okay, as we move into section 1.4, experimental design, we should first talk about variables. Now, variables in our context means something different from what we talk about in other branches of math. It's best to think about it in terms of what we want to study in day-to-day life. For instance, if you are going into education, you may be thinking about how does types of praise, so whether you praise students for their accomplishments, right? So accomplishments, or whether you praise them for their effort, right? And how that affects their academic aptitude. Now, these are fairly broad kinds of variables, right? Notice that these can be the types of praise. Well, that is, this is categorical. So we have a categorical variable here. And we're examining academic aptitude, which can be measured in terms of test scores, or some other holistic score that can be numerical. So this is maybe discrete or continuous, quantitative. It depends on your context, but this is common. So the idea is, how do we examine how this variable affects this variable? And so while we're looking at the kinds of data that we can collect here, the variables themselves, right? Well, when we want to study them, we are interested in how an explanatory variable affects a response variable. So depending on changes in the explanatory variable, we'll have some response in the response variable. Okay, so something is going to change in how we measure academic aptitude. For instance, depending on whether we use accomplishment praise or effort praise or neither, or some other kind of praise. So the problem is, when we talk about variables and experimental design, if we want to study this, we need to be aware of any confounding variables. So confounding variables are any variables that we've neglected to consider in our study design. For instance, for type of praise, what things should we think about in terms of the students that we're working with, right? So maybe socioeconomic background. Are we talking about looking at students from all sorts of backgrounds, or just students from El Dorado Hills, for instance? What about racial identity? The age of the students, right? You maybe will get more for praising, you might get more out of praising younger students for their effort than older students. What other things? Geographic location. The funding at that school. Student to teacher ratio. So there's a lot. There's a lot to consider here. And any one of these may be affecting that relationship. We don't know to what extent. But if we fail to neglect those, this can pose problems for our studies. So that's why proper experimental design will make sure that we can account for as many confounding variables as possible. In particular, for this example, I was thinking of a study from the College of Education at Sac State. It was not performed by them necessarily, but it was cited And there was a very strong influence of socioeconomic background that was not accounted for in the experimental design.